The original Eye of the Beholder was a breakthrough success in the fantasy RPG scene in the 90s, bringing strong narrative and accessible gameplay to a genre that had a reputation for being clunky and confusing. When you take a look at Forgotten Realms games preceding the release of Eye of the Beholder, the difference is night and day. Those older titles, while having a charm of their own, don't even compare when set alongside the technological marvel that was Eye of the Beholder. The game was leaps and bounds ahead of others, not only in terms of graphical improvements, but in terms of gameplay accessibility as well. Eye of the Beholder marked a point in the RPG world where your games no longer had to look and run like a tabletop game. They could instead feature immersive and realistic gameplay. If you're looking at the graphics on display here and thinking, gee, that doesn't look very realistic, Mr. Internet Walrus. Remember, this was 1991. This is before the concept of FPS was even truly mainstream, predating even Wolfenstein.
Yeah!
Having this much action for an RPG was pretty rare, but that was the first game, the proof of concept, if you will. Now that Westwood had tasted success and set a high standard, would they be able to do it again with a sequel? Let's find out. Eye of the Beholder 2 was developed, as the original was, by Westwood Studios. Well, actually by Westwood Associates, but that's just semantics, as the company would change names when it was bought by Virgin Games in 1992. What really matters is that Westwood created some of the best dungeon crawler RPGs of the 90s, maybe of all time, responsible for both Eye of the Beholder and Lands of Lore. They are also responsible for the Command & Conquer series of RTS games, a series I have shockingly not played, ever. Every video I post, I get a few more games added onto the to play list. You would think posting videos would lessen my list, yet somehow it only grows, much like the SAS levels of my editing squad.
Our SAS grows with our disappointment.
That's right, they have voices now. Harrowing stuff. What stands out as most impressive about the development of Eye of the Beholder 2, outside it just being an amazing game, is that it released less than a year after its predecessor. At a core level, it had an identical gameplay loop, but the game itself added a massive amount of content to the original, not just in the new items and abilities, but also in story depth. While it can be argued that both games have the basic loop of enter the dungeon, fight your way to the boss, and claim his head, Eye of the Beholder 1 was extremely thin on story to actually get you through that, with most of the focus being on gameplay and atmosphere in the dungeons. Conversely, Eye of the Beholder 2 improved on those original gameplay elements, and also added a ton to the storytelling, with significantly more NPC interactions and cutscenes. The first thing I thought when starting this game was, hey, this animation style is really giving me Lands of Lore vibes, which, you know, makes sense, this being their last dungeon crawler before making Lands of Lore. You really see a ton of evolution to animations and interactions. Everything just felt a lot more alive. Instead of standing in front of a random dwarf during a conversation, we would get unique artwork panes to introduce new characters that just drip that iconic Westwood charm. Just look at the difference here for character recruitment. It's not comparable. Here we have a fully animated interaction with our new party member. In the original, we got little more than a wall of text. The story we have here follows on right after that of the original game. If you'll recall, the first game ends with the death of the evil beholder Xanathar, and our escape from the dungeons under Waterdeep. Here we start out trying to stay dry on a rainy night in the city of Waterdeep when we're summoned by the Archmage of the city, Kelbin Blackstaff. For any D&D nerds out there, Kelbin is a pretty significant character in the Forgotten Realms as a chosen of Mystra. We find him in his study with what is probably the coolest fireplace I've ever seen. He lets us know that evil is stirring in the Temple of Darkmoon. He dispatched a scout, Amber, to look into it for him, but she's yet to report back after several days. He fears the worst, and hot on the heels of our success against the Beholder under Waterdeep, he thinks we will be the perfect instrument of his will. And with a little more fanfare, we're teleported to the woods outside Darkmoon, about to embark on an adventure to dwarf the one we just completed. This section of the video is going to be pretty swift. As I stated earlier, the gameplay in this title is nearly identical to its predecessor. You control a party of up to 6 members, playing in a world governed by 2nd edition D&D. Don't worry though, you don't need to know much about D&D to get into this one. All the calculations and dice rolls happen in the background. Party composition remains similar to the original, with only your front rank being able to strike in melee, while the back rank is limited to spells and ranged attacks. Ranged combat remains largely unchanged from the original. You load up your quiver with arrows and launch them at your enemies. As before, your arrows never break, but you need to pick them up after each battle. It's certainly immersive, but I have to admit I often wouldn't have my archers attack at all, as the pain in picking up their arrows didn't feel worth it. Also, when compared to the massive damage of my melee characters and the battlefield clearing AoE of my mages, the piddly arrows often didn't feel worthwhile. I might just be lazy though. The big change you're going to feel in this entry is the utility of your casters. As this is a direct continuation of the original, you're controlling a much higher level party, and as such, your casters are going to have a much deeper and much more varied pool of spells to choose from. Unlike the first game, where fireballs and lightning bolts were saved for the toughest foes only, here, magic is a part of my rotation pretty regularly. And with my main party containing 2 mages and 2 clerics, I would be wheeling and dealing through spellbooks throughout. I was pretty well bringing a storm of weather with me through the halls. The place was in need of a good washing out anyhow. Though in a totally different perspective, it's hard not to see this game as a more primitive version of Baldur's Gate. And one thing that this game has that would carry on to Baldur's Gate is the ability to import your characters from the prior game. I could be wrong here, but this is the first game I can think of where you import your characters from the previous title, and it makes a huge difference. I tried creating a party from scratch, and while they were competent, they were much lower level than my party from the first game, and had pretty basic bitch items. Alternately, my imported party not only had higher stats, but kept a great deal of their inventory from the first game, giving me a huge leg up, with +5 weapons and a massive repertoire of spells right off the hop. Also, we just have all those great memories from the first game. The only bad news is that you can only import 4 characters, not the full party of 6. So our tag-alongs like the Prince of the Dwarves and our resurrected mage friend won't be joining us on this entry. That's alright. Quent likes to keep his social circle tight-knit anyway. As we are now a far more seasoned party of adventurers, we don't have to start our journey in the sewers this time. Instead, we start out in the woods outside Darkmoon Temple. This is the only outdoor area in the game, but was actually a bragging point for the game on its release. Imagine a time where having a quick jaunt in the trees is advertisement worthy. Westwood really ran with this too, with about half of their later title, Lands of Lore, taking place in outdoor spaces. A simpler time. Aside from being constantly accosted by wolves, not much is going on in the woods until we find, and I quote, an old haggard woman who is willing to guide us to Darkmoon Temple. Kind of a rude way to describe someone helping us, but we take her offer and head to the frankly ominous temple. Entering the temple, we meet Nadia and Jorel. Don't get too attached to them. We let them know we're looking for Kelbin's scout, but they seem taken aback, stating the temple and the woods are harmless. I think the 45 million wolves that try to rip our eyeballs out kind of prove that wrong, but sure, whatever you say. Further back in the foyer, you can also meet a startled-looking woman who is searching for her missing sister, Calandra. Yeah, real safe place. 2 missing persons in the span of like 15 seconds. These priests are a shady sort for sure. Well, from here there's only really one way to go, into the temple. Trying to pass the threshold, our creepy priest couple tells us it's a restricted area, but we're here on official business, and I'm not going back into the Wolfwood. Ignoring the priests causes them to attack, but lucky for us, someone forgot to tell them a party composition of 2 clerics is trash, and we send them back to their evil god. We explore the upper levels of the temple a bit, but find little more than locked doors. Moving below, we find a dungeon unbefitting what should be found in the house of a benevolent deity. We also note it appears to be of drow construction. Might be some credence to those rumors of evil stirring in Darkmoon. Moving through the dungeons, we find a jail cell inhabited by a halfling thief named Insol. I let him in my group, but his most defining trait is that he's an asshole. On your first rest, not only does he disappear, but he also steals a bunch of your party's items. You can't have anything nice here. Regardless, in the guard barracks down here we find a horn, and a note stating that the 4 horns are capable of breaking the seal. No idea what that means yet, but we'll hold on to the horn. On the next floor we find some more prisoners. First is a dwarf that we free from his chains, and he scampers off to warn his people of the dangers of the Darkmoon clerics. According to the clue book included with the game, he can actually ask to join the party, but he didn't for me. I have no clue if it's random chance or there's some metric I missed, but he didn't ask to join. Bummer. Just down the hall we find Calandra, the woman that went missing in the woods here. Turns out she was captured by the clerics as well. Letting her go, she joins up with us. Finally a reliable party member. And just in time as we encounter our first big battle of the game. Locked behind a door is an absolute army of undead warriors. We employ some kiting and separation tactics to clear them out, and are rewarded with a key that allows access to the lower dungeons. Just before leaving the level, Kelvin reaches out again. He's worried by the undead army forming here, and will be seeking the assistance of the Lords of Waterdeep. In the meantime, we are to keep delving deeper. The next floor is rough as well. Upon moving into the tunnels below, we're locked in a maze filled with demons, slimes, and even a colony of giant ants, all of which respawn. To top things off, this area has some bad juju going on. Attempting to rest meets you with this screen. Not a good time. As is a theme we're now discovering, this entry in the series is a massive step up in difficulty from the original title. And as bad as this area seems, trust me, it gets a lot rougher before the journey is complete. We scrape by and eventually find a stone crystal, allowing us to escape the accursed maze through a teleporter, and grants us access to the interior of Darkmoon Temple. The good news is that the maze contained the other horns we needed, so we're just searching for the seal to break now. Deeper in the cleric's quarters, we also come across a pile of bones with a scrawled note. Looks like these unfortunate bones belong to Amber, Kelvin's scout from Waterdeep. Essentially, she thought she could infiltrate the Order of the Darkmoon, but it's pretty clear that she died in her attempt at their initiation ritual. The good news is, we can resurrect her and even add her to our party. We do that, and as a mage she is super helpful, but it raises some questions for us. She's an elf, and according to 2nd edition rules, which this game employs, you can't use Raise Dead on an elf. The reason for this is that elves don't have souls, they have spirits, which apparently means a Raise Dead spell won't work on them. Even in the game, if she dies again, she cannot be raised. Any other race can. The only possible explanation is that we used a special shrine to bring her bones back to life. Still, weird oversight. Anyhow, she's part of the party now, and she'll be with us until the end. We find a wall that the 4 horns are able to open up.
Oh my god, what the hell was that?
Just like that, we've reached the Trial of Faith. The trial that supposedly claimed the life of Amber. She is apparently a mute, as she says nothing of this. In fact, she never says a single word to the party after her resurrection. The game improved the story elements, but still has a lack of party member interaction.
She mentions illusory walls you donut.
Before starting the trial proper, we can find another fellow locked in a room. Tanglor the Fighter Cleric. With how punishing this title has been so far, we decide to send Calandra on her way and recruit the scrappy dwarf into our party. He replaces her in the front rank, and we now have our composition for the remainder of the game. Moving into the Trial of Faith, it's less of a trial and more of a room filled with lightning traps and mantids. The mantids are a hassle. They practically always paralyze on hit, meaning that second cleric is going to have his work cut out for him in keeping us mobile with remove paralysis. This point marks the spot in the game where practically every enemy has some sort of status effect. You need to bring your A game to keep your party rested at all times to counter these effects. The only other thing worth mentioning on this floor is that it contains the first of these weird mouth puzzles, where you need to feed a mouth on the wall certain items to progress. It is absolutely as weird as it sounds. This one wants bones. Sure thing. Take my bones, wall mouth. I only feel slightly violated.
Disgusting!
The next floor has some more nightmare fuel in the form of these super creepy mouthless beholders that chase you around. They make no noise and just stare at you. As an enemy, they don't have an attack, but will explode if poked. They are easy to take out with arrows from a range, but they creep me out big time. I've dubbed them boom holders. The rest of the floor is inhabited by mass numbers of flying snakes, and your goal is to feed 8 more of those mouths. Each has a riddle, and for the most part, the items they need can be found around this level of the temple. There is one optional encounter that is sort of interesting. You can find a cleric sitting on a button claiming to have failed the trial, awaiting his death. You can choose to leave him, or attack him for the treasure lying behind him. I would recommend you leave him to his fate, as killing him breaks the switch he's standing on, closing the door behind you and leaving you to a horrible death of starvation. Actually, I guess our cleric can create food, so we wouldn't starve, just slowly go insane trapped in a stone tomb of our own creation. Grim. Moving past the mouth puzzles, we finally meet the big boss here, Dran Dragor, self-described as a high priest and overlord of this realm. His intro is some spooky stuff. He has that unsettling confidence of someone who sees you as little more than an insect, an observation that will later prove to be pretty close to the truth. For now, he locks the door behind us, preventing us from retreating to the relative safety of the snake-infested hallways behind us. And believe me, we're gonna miss those snakes real soon. The entire floor is filled with beholders. That's right, it's not just the namesake of the series. This place is lousy with the eyeball beasts. Now, if you watched my playthrough of the original, you might be thinking, oh, well, these are probably not as overpowered as the end boss Xanathar. They must be nerfed versions. Nope. Outside of no longer needing a special item to kill, these beholders are just as overpowered as Xanathar. They cast N-tier spells that will destroy your party. Their attacks are mostly one-shot kills and can target the entire party. To make things more interesting, they're damn near immune to magic and ranged attacks nearly always miss. We're going to have to fight these beasts in melee, and even a single hit can wipe the party. This is where we need to learn and master the sidestep technique that will become necessary to finish the game. See, the enemies have a bit of a delay before attacking when they get into melee range, so in order to deal damage to them without receiving hits in return, we need to get in close, take a quick swing, then sidestep before they can strike back. The challenge here is getting the timing just right, and in long hallways this is impossible to employ at all, often forcing you to kite the beasts into rooms with some space to maneuver. Even then, it's not a sure bet, as the monsters are quick, and can just as easily scoop in behind you when you're trying to lure them side to side. And one disintegrate will end your party unless you are extremely lucky. I cannot overstate how quickly these beasts chain spells. Even standing still for a couple of seconds will give the beholder more than enough time to unleash a volley of death and destruction. Now, as much as this may sound like terrible game design, to me it was actually really quite enjoyable. It added some real tension to the encounters that wouldn't have been there otherwise. As fun as the first game was, none of the combat had near this level of strategy needed. In that entry, you really just needed to overpower your enemies with raw strength. Trying to do that here is going to lead you to a quick wipe. Anyhow, moving through the floor, Kelvin once again reaches out to the party telepathically. We let him know about meeting Dran, and the Archmage lets us know we should avoid him at all costs. If a Chosen is worried about someone being too powerful, it's probably a threat you should take seriously. He tries to give us more information, but states a magical barrier has been erected around Darkmoon, and that he likely won't be able to contact us again before being abruptly cut off. So we're trapped in Darkmoon with an evil priest whose power level makes even a Chosen take pause. That sucks. With nowhere to go but forward, we keep moving into the Beholder lair. Toward the end, we find a Beholder caught in a hole, illustrated by probably my favorite artwork in the entire game. We can either help him or attack. Ultimately, it makes little difference, as he attacks us even if we show him kindness. Lame, but we remove him from existence, claim his cool green hammer, and make our way to the end of this nightmare maze. In the final room is a pedestal we need to touch to gain the Mark of the Darkmoon, a sigil needed to gain access to the inner temple. Unfortunately, the spirit administering the trials gets wise to us not being true members of the Darkmoon and sends 2 beholders to eliminate us. Fighting one of these at a time is difficult, 2 is nearly impossible. So we make a mad dash between them to get the seal of the Darkmoon. Lucky for us, completion of the trial teleports us back to the main hall, and we don't have to deal with those 2 beholders. Or any more at all, for that matter. Don't worry though, the Beholders are one of the harder enemies, but more challenges still await. With the seal of the Darkmoon and our fancy green hammer we found, we're able to gain access to the next tower, the Azure Tower. And this one is another gauntlet of death. It's not all bad though. Near the start of the tower, we can find an ancient elf who has apparently gathered some sort of energy from the boulette creatures that inhabit the floor. He offers to share that power if you'll just touch his hand. It may seem like a trap, but touching his hand will give whoever does the deed a full level of experience. We give that power to Puent, as he's really carrying this party. The goal for the rest of the tower is to construct the many parts of Talon, a powerful longsword, and gain access to Dran's inner sanctum, the Crimson Tower. This first floor is absolutely lousy with basilisks. Not as deadly as the Beholders, but still a threat as they can turn your party to stone with a gaze. And unlike the Beholders, their numbers are unlimited. They will continually respawn. Luckily, they are susceptible to magic, so keeping them at a range and destroying them with spells gets us through. We find the key to the Crimson Tower pretty early on, and end the floor with a challenge teleporter. We need to drop all our spell books and holy symbols, meaning we will have no magic in the next rooms. Luckily, I still have some spell wands I carried over from Eye of the Beholder 1, and can use them to decimate the boulettes. At the end of the challenge, we come against a guardian demon, a sort of bear-bat-elephant hybrid. He's not much of a challenge, and his defeat awards the first piece of Talon. We regain our spellcasting implements and come to the next part of the tower, the Maze of the Medusa. Now don't be confused by my singular use of the word Medusa. This place is lousy with the snake-headed women. They come in massive packs. I was surrounded by as many as 8 of the ugly ladies at one time. The good news is, I've been collecting mirrored shields for the last while, and putting one in the hand of each of your party members grants immunity to the Medusa's main threat, flesh to stone. Without that power, they are trivial to defeat, though they can poison you, so you still need to be aware of that. At the end of the maze, we pick up the hilt of Talon, and entering the final room, we're trapped in a glass cage by Dran. My first thought was that we were about to be squished by spikes like poor Xanathar from the first game. But I guess Dran prefers to take captives alive, and we're instead dropped into his prison below. The next segment is very simple, but super challenging if you aren't prepared. The prison, of course, has other occupants, and they are not the friendly sort. The place is filled with frost giants. They don't have much in the way of magic or ranged capability, but their melee attacks will damage the entire party, so you'll be fighting to keep your squishier party members alive. Some on-point healing, and maybe the use of Wall of Force to create some safe rest areas, will get you through the area without too much trouble. I can't help but feel a little bad for the giants in this area. They are captive as we are, except for the fact that they barely fit in these tiny corridors. Like, imagine being imprisoned in a space the size of a hamster tube with 30 other people. Absolute torture. Killing them is a mercy. At the end, we find the king of the frost giants. He's a bit more reasonable than his subjects, and instead of trying to squash us, he gives us the last piece of talon and mysteriously turns to dust. Behind him is a human-sized teleporter so we can escape this hellscape. Back in the main temple now, we have all we need to assault the Crimson Tower. We first forge Talon using a special wall shrine, then move on to the final stretch. Ironically, Talon is only a +4 weapon, whereas my holdover from Eye of the Beholder 1 is a +5. Still equip it anyhow. There are some interesting encounters in the Crimson Tower, like a dwarf that can apparently become a plant, but the floor is a lot shorter than the other areas we've gone through already. The final floor before Dran's lair is large and inhabited by powerful salamander enemies. They are tough, but easy enough to dispatch so long as you keep the party from getting surrounded. There are two main directions we can go on this floor. One will lead to Dran, the other is a room absolutely packed to the gills with Illithid. Like, I'm talking dozens of Illithid. I have no idea what they're guarding, but after dying in that room a couple dozen times, I decided that just going to Dran was the way to go. I don't mess with mind mages, for real. Finally, at the top of this house of horrors, we find Dran conducting some ritual. He reveals that he is the one that had the Drow construct the cursed catacombs below Darkmoon, and that he was in league with Xanathar to overthrow Waterdeep. Those catacombs were ancient. This means Dran is a lot older than he seems, and probably not exactly human. We don't have much time to ponder this discovery as Dran attacks, leveling a volley of deadly spells in our direction. He's not overly hard to deal with. Treating him similarly to the Beholders from before to avoid his spells is fairly effective, and before long we have him grounded. Not that simple though. Dran rises with a laugh and enters his true form, that of a massive red dragon. Shit. This phase is handled practically in the same way as the last, with the need to employ our strafing tactics, but the stakes are much higher this time. A single flame blast from Dran is likely to kill your entire party, and he is all but immune to everything outside damage from Talon. Essentially, your fighter is going to solo a red dragon here. It takes me a few tries, but we eventually get into a good rhythm and conquer the beast, with only Puent and Cordio surviving the affair. I literally only got hit once, and that's what it did to my party. Once Dran has breathed his last, his wards around Darkmoon fail, and Kelvin shows up to offer his congratulations. But there's one final step left. Darkmoon Temple is a cursed place, and it can't be left standing lest someone else take its power for themselves. Kelvin kindly teleports us out, and we see the temple destroyed by a host of powerful mages. And that's it, at least until the next adventure. There's always another adventure. Let's get to some arguing with the World Wide Web. We just have one review today, but don't worry, it's a long one. EOTBII. My god, it's brutal. You're going to be constantly reloading due to deaths and status effects. Early on, it's poison. This soon becomes trivial with potions and spells. However, later on, you have multiple beholders with insta-death spells and tight corridors. Then you have petrifying basilisks, and very soon after that, medusas. These are a massive problem because you can at most have about 6 items which can cure this status. 4 of which are pixie dust bags acquired at the very beginning of the game with no indication of what they're for. The spell for it is locked at the highest level of mage spells for some reason, so it's very unlikely you'll get there by the time you need it, if at all. Now ordinarily, you could reasonably try to battle your way through all this with careful avoidance, etc. Unfortunately, they decided to make monsters infinitely respawn on every level, so you're going to be constantly bombarded while trying to get through the levels. With plenty of backtracking, this soon becomes a massive chore. So I'll start with the one part I do agree with here. Yes, you will want to save a lot in this game. Luckily for us, they give you more than one save slot this time around, so you can make multiple saves to prevent any soft blocking. We've talked about the beholder situation, and yes, this person is correct, they are tough. But I think that's sort of the point. They're beholders. They're supposed to be super difficult, but their mechanics are fair. Once you can master the strategy to deal with them, they're absolutely winnable. The big difference between this title and the original is that there's a lot more need to employ tactics against your enemies. Between the early skeletal army requiring tight use of choke points to avoid being overwhelmed, to the aforementioned spell dodge tactics for beholders, to the use of mirrored shields against the Medusas, there is always a way to overcome the difficulties you face in the dungeons. As far as the basilisks are concerned, you find the mage scroll for stone to flesh multiple times in the course of the game, and it's not unrealistic to get your mage to a level where he can cast it, completely trivializing the basilisk's gaze. Or you can do what I did, and keep the big lizards at a range. They're very squishy. I never once had the need to use the magic dust. I finished the game with 6 spares. If this game would have followed the same formula as the first, where you can just overwhelm your enemies with raw power, I still think it would have been a good game, but it would have lost a lot of the nuance and strategic play required. While I generally agree respawning enemies are a damper on games, they work well here, I think, and they are more balanced than you may think. By allowing a respawning source of experience, you give players struggling a chance to farm that experience, if they need to. I believe I finished the game with my highest character at level 10, but the game allows for leveling as high as level 13, so if I were struggling, there was room for improvement should it be needed. In addition, not all monsters respawn. The snakes, priests, and other weaker enemies, sure, they could come back. Beholders, while numerous, were finite in number. The frost giants, again, very tough, but limited in number. So you could absolutely systematically wipe out their population in the dungeon, or do like I did, and run past when the challenge outweighs the rewards. The design allows for the player to make tactical choices as they see fit, something that separates and elevates this game above the original, as far as I'm concerned. The point of D&D has never been to just steamroll through everything. The point is to find interesting and unique ways to overcome what would otherwise be insurmountable odds. This game does a much better job than the first at creating combat encounters that feel more like puzzles than just direct combat. The answer is not always straightforward, and that's a good thing. If it's not clear, I had an absolutely wonderful time with this entry in the Beholder series. While not as groundbreaking as the original, this title was an improvement in just about every single way. The combat was rich and tactical. The story elements were elevated exponentially. The sound design was wonderful and atmospheric. And overall, this is bordering on dethroning Lands of Lore as my favorite dungeon crawler of all time. My best comparison I can make for this game to anyone looking to give it a run through is that it is to the Beholder series what Baldur's Gate 2 was to the Baldur's Gate series. It took the prototype and concept from a groundbreaking title and just polished and improved everything. In terms of raw gameplay, this blows the original out of the water. It of course could only be there because of the groundwork that original laid out, but it is nonetheless a better title in every sense. The game is one of the most accessible dungeon crawlers out there, probably only second to Lands of Lore. And those with even the faintest understanding of D&D rules will be able to pick this up with very little difficulty, which is saying something for a title of this age. There is some undefinable quality of these games that just makes them stick with you well past the credits screen, and it's something I think all D&D fans need to experience. Do yourself a favor, answer the summons from Kelvin, enter the temple, and uncover a dark conspiracy centuries in the making. Just don't forget your longsword. See you in the next video.